So we're going to talk about calibrating our hoops. And the first thing that I want to say is that the information that you might read in your manual might conflict with what is actually the most logical way to go about calibrating a hoop. So what is calibrating a hoop? It simply is the fact that you've got a grid that's going to sit in any of your embroidery hoops, and every hoop is going to have its appropriate grid that go along with it. So the important thing about your machine and my machine is that they might be a little bit different. Even though they're manufactured in the same factory, and even though these plastic grids are all made in the same factory, the printed plastic may differ slightly from one machine to another for what you've received when you bought your machine. And so that's why it's really, really important that you calibrate your hoop with its own grid that came with your hoop to your machine settings. Now, the machine settings are also going to be a little bit different because they've been manufactured in a factory, and when they put the software in the machine that's going to communicate with the embroidery unit of the machine, there's internal settings that a Janome tech can change to determine where that center crosshair is at of your embroidery field on your machine. And again, that movement might be slightly different from one machine to another. So when you're calibrating so that what the machine thinks is the center of your hoop is the center of your grid. These three things, the machine, the grid, and your hoop, all need to be consistent. So I can calibrate my machine, just to say this as an aside. This is not my grid. I just picked up this other one here. It's really important that I stick with my own personal things. So one person that's with us today forgot to bring her grid, so we're going to go ahead and calibrate her machine to my grid. But when she gets home and she's got her own grid again, it's going to be really important that she calibrates her own machine back to her grid, just in case, or at least check it, just to make sure that hers isn't different, slightly different. All right, so the process that we're going to go through right now for calibrating is we've got a piece of hoop stabilizer. And it's not necessary to hoop anything in the hoop when you calibrate your grid. This is really important information I'm giving you because our manual is going to tell us to go into the machine embroidery settings and use that calibration pattern, which is simply, Kelly, why don't you show what you've already stitched out actually. So take your grid off.
Take your grid off.
So what Kelly did is she went ahead and she stitched the crosshair, which is called the calibration pattern, in every single Janome embroidery machine. The point I'm trying to make is that's not necessary.
And it's not the same.
Okay, and what she's commenting on right now is that it's not lined up with her grid.
Oh, well,
Okay.
I see that.
All right, so that's an important thing, that it's not lining up with your grid, because that goes to show that what the machine thinks is the center of your hoop is not the center of your plastic grid. Okay, so what do we really need to pay attention to? What we really need to pay attention to is not that stitched out calibration pattern. What we need to pay attention to is, let's open up our sewing machine, let's go into the embroidery mode of the machine, and then from there, we're going to calibrate a hoop. We can calibrate every single one of our hoops. You know, in the Janome 15,000 has 5 different hoops, about 5 different hoops that we could calibrate, and we have to do each one individually. So today we're working with our GR hoop, and we're now going to come to the machine and we're going to walk through the process of calibrating it. Okay? To calibrate our hoop, the first step is that you've got your machine. Obviously your machine has to be turned on. You have to be in the embroidery mode, and it's actually helpful if you go ahead and open up the embroidery edit screen, so that your machine knows that you're serious about being in the embroidery mode. Because I know that there have been some people that if they're don't have like either a ready to sew screen open or at least a grid or something open, sometimes the settings don't want to hold quite as easily. So we're either ready to sew or an edit screen open on the machine. On the machine itself, you've got your hoop that you're going to calibrate, and you've got a grid that goes with it. Make sure that the grid is inside the little notches so that it's not flopping around in there. It's got to be properly in place. And what you want to notice here is we've taken the embroidery foot off of the machine and we just have a naked needle standing here. And what we want to do is lower our needle, and where is it falling in relation to that hole in the middle of the grid. Now here on Nancy, and I'm gonna show you this because your grid will flop around just a little tiny bit. And what you wanna do with it is you just wanna like say, if I'm gonna pop my grid in here, just plop it in there and you know, that's more or less the center of the grid. It's not going to be that, you know, that you've gotta try to be manipulating this around all the time. So what I see with Nancy's needle, I'm looking at it over here from the side view, and I can look at it and I can see that it's a little bit, her needle's a little bit too far toward me. It's not exactly in the center of this crosshair. And I don't know if it's gonna be real obvious on the screen, but trust me, that's the case. It's not right in the middle. So raise your needle back up out of the machine. As I mentioned before, we've got a piece of stabilizer in here, but you don't need to have anything hooped at all. You can just be doing this with your grid. So from here, what you wanna do is go down to the settings of your machine. From here, you want to go over into the embroidery mode and just page down until you get to the place where it says hoop calibration and say yes. All right, so now the little message will pop up that the hoop is actually going to move to the center position, and just verify that it is. So look what happened. You know, we weren't showing where the center of the hoop is, but now look what happened. The needle is even further over to the right than what it was, and I shouldn't have done that because I just punched a hole in your needle, on your grid, my grid.
Your grid. You just punched a hole in my new needle in your grid.
And my grid just has a hole that it never had before. Shouldn't have done it. And I usually don't use the needle down function. I usually use the hand wheel on the machine, but it's way off. All right? So when we were in embroidery mode, it showed that it was centered, but when we're in the calibration mode, it is not centered in that hole. So what we need to do next is come up to our screen here and make sure that you pick the right hoop for what you've actually got on the machine.
This is the wrong hoop.
Yep, so we need to pick the GR hoop. And now it's going to move to center position, so let's see if anything changed. Aha, it did move, and this time I am gonna be smarter and use my needle, my hand wheel. And it is going down, and it's not quite in the center again.
But not
But
as
it's not
far
real
off
bad.
as SQ23. Interesting.
Yeah, interesting, yep, because they're all, those grids are all different. Now where this needle is at is it the hole that was punched previously when we were actually in the embroidery mode. So it's calibrated there to a little bit off to the left and a little bit forward, too far forward. So on our screen here, this is the little arrow buttons that we're gonna use, and they are actually opposite of what we think we need. So typically when we're jogging a design, if we said we wanted to come forward, we'd be using this forward button. When you're calibrating, it's opposite. I want my needle to move back a little bit. So I'm gonna, and it's just going at a millimeter at a time. So I'm gonna go back a little bit, and I want my needle to go a little bit to the right, which means I'm going to jog the hoop. This is jogging the hoop,
Okay.
not jogging the needle. So I'm gonna go a couple of dingbats to the right. I'm gonna check my needle. Did I go too far? I'm a little bit too far forward. So let's try it again. Let's go backward. Yeah, nope, I'm still way off. I'm actually gonna come forward. I think I've moved too far. And the longer you hold this down, it goes 1 millimeter at a time, so it can be kind of a slow process. We just need to go to the left. We're pretty good right here.
Yes.
I kind of like that. You know, if I'm pressing down on this a little tiny bit, I can see that I'm kind of in the center. Do you see any improvements you'd like?
It looks great.
You think it looks fine? All right, so once you've got it where you like it, get your needle up out of the bed of the machine and say okay. You're back on your main adjustment screen here for settings, and I want you to say okay once again. All right, if you don't say okay here, it's not gonna save that setting that you just changed it. So that's how you calibrate the hoop to your machine. All right, the next step of this process is if you have a cloth setter, then you're gonna wanna go over to your cloth setter. You're gonna keep this same grid on this hoop, and you're going to calibrate the cloth setter so that it also says at the center of that hoop is the center of the cloth setter. So now we're at our cloth setter with our hoop that has been calibrated to its matching grid. And the way that we're going to see how well this cloth setter is lined up is we're just gonna drop the arm gently down into the middle and we're gonna see, gosh, this one's really good. The crosshairs are almost absolutely perfect. However, we're gonna run over to the machine over here, to the cloth setter over here,
Okay.
to our left, and we're gonna show that Kelly is working at getting hers lined up, because a few seconds ago, her
I just
hoop
did
was
it.
way off.
Yeah, well, you can see
Yep.
it's off still.
So we're still gonna work on it a little bit. And the way that we'll do this is we're just going to loosen up the screws that are on the plate, the middle plate of the cloth setter. Loosen them up, not a whole bunch, because underneath there, you're gonna lose your nut if you don't. There's a little, it's kind of a nuts and bolts thing. Loosen it up just enough that you can start to wiggle this plate around and match up your crosshair of the red crosshair of the cloth setter with the blue lines that are on your grid. And when you get it perfect, go ahead and come back to the screws using your large screwdriver.
So
Tighten
on
them up.
Kelly's, you're seeing a double line, but that's because she has a stitched line
Yes.
on her tearaway.
See that?
See, so ignore that one.
Yep, very good. Ignore that one. So the main thing is that this cloth setter is now in tune perfectly with this particular grid.
Beautiful.
All right, and with that machine. All right, so this is why sometimes when you go to a class and not everybody has their own grid, or not everybody has their own cloth setter, people might get some varying results with where their machine is saying the center of the hoop is at. So it really is important, that you do this on your own and that you have your stuff set up. And it's only primarily going to be important when we're working on a project like we are today. Today's project, I have divided up this design so that we are trying to maximize how much embroidery we can get at one time into one hooping. And what I did is, I have this design even rotated in the hoop. We'll look at the templates in a little while, because we're maximizing that hoop space, because I didn't want to be sitting at my embroidery machine for 2 days trying to stitch out 12 tulips, all right? So when we have done that, it's mandatory that that center of the hoop is exactly where the template that's printed is the center. All right. Okay, so I want to talk about the finished design first of all. And what I want to make clear about when you're doing a design like this, what we started out with was a purchase design set, which is known as a tile scene. So as we all know, we all bought this set, and it was going to be stitched out in 8 individual blocks. We had our choice of sizes that we could choose to make this in. And when I started looking at this design and I started looking at the actual embroidery files, I just decided that I didn't want to do mine as squares. I looked at the design and I just thought, for my own personal design, I want to do this as what I call a multi-hooped project, which meant that I was going to try to stitch it out on a single piece of fabric, and I was going to eliminate all those seam lines. Well, when I wanted to start eliminating those seam lines, there was a couple of problems that were obviously going to arise, and that was that I wanted to, also just for the integrity of the design, I wanted to eliminate any splits that I might possibly have in the stems or places in the design like the leaves that were going to be split apart. I just decided it was going to be worth my time to go into my digitizing program, do a layout of all of the blocks, and then do some redigitizing so that, for example, my leaves were going to be a continuous piece of fabric rather than having leaves with seams in them. So what is the approach? The approach is that it's ideal if you've got embroidery digitizing software so that you can open up all of those designs and you can do a layout of them. When you do a layout of them, what you're going to do with your individual squares is you're going to line up the seam lines, and you are then going to start analyzing your design, and you're going to take a look at it from the perspective of a three-dimensional object. So obviously when you're looking at this tulip scene here, you can see that some of the tulips and some of the leaves are further behind than other parts of the design. So you've got to start thinking about that from that perspective as you start to rip this design apart. I call it ripping it apart because you then have to consider another thing, which is which size of the designs do you want to use, which hoop therefore is going to be the one that you're going to try to cram as much of the design into at a time, because the purpose of multi-hooping is to make a design that looks like it's a continuous embroidery. You want to try to eliminate having places where you've got obvious splits, you just want it to look like it was, somebody took a picture of a flower garden and then they interpreted it in an applique embroidered design. So put some thought into it. Anytime you've got a design and you've got digitizing software, you can approach almost any tile scene from this same perspective, where you just take a look at it and just kind of analyze it and decide what it is that you want to try to include in each hooping. So for this design, I'm using my 5-inch design blocks, and I'm using my GR hoop, which is the largest hoop for the Janome 15,000 machine. And I just spent a lot of time in front of my computer combining designs and splitting them apart. And what I sent to my students was the templates and the design file so they could print their own templates up. And the template is really important. We're going to take a look at one here that one of our students did, and she had opened her design up in her software program, and then she sent it to her printer, and when the printer printed it up, what she had neglected to do was say that she wanted to print it at 100%. You've got to have it at 100%, because if it's at 83%, that's not the actual design size, and this template is basically no good. Because your design sizes need to be the size of your actual embroidery files, all right? So this happens a lot to people, they just, the printer settings that are in their software program, oftentimes, you have to look at it and change the default on that and say, I always want it to be at 100%. Now, there may be times when you don't want it at 100%, and that may be a time when you want just to see the entire design, as it might possibly, this would be an example, this isn't an exact one, but maybe you would want to see what the whole design looks like in the layout. And you might want to print a small picture of it so that you can just keep that next to your sewing machine so you know where you're at. So there may be a time when you would choose to print something not at the 100% size, but not often. All right, so that wasn't criticizing her, I just want to make sure you all knew that this is a common problem that can happen with our projects. All right, so once we've got our templates printed at 100%, the next thing that we're going to do with them, they're going to look like this. So bring the camera over, and we're going to have a pile of papers here. This is going to be hooping number 1. This is the crosshair for the center of the hoop, right here. All right, because when I was digitizing this and when I was laying it out in the hoop, I had to tilt the design in order to get this big, long stem to fit in that hoop without having to break it apart. It didn't have a good spot. I mean, I could have split it apart probably right in here, and I think I did that actually for the machine, for the 500 machine, as I didn't make a split there. But for us with the bigger hoop, it was like, let's get as much as we can get in there. And this is what your templates are gonna look like at full size. So how do we get them all together? Well, first of all, what you wanna do is, it's kind of helpful if you've got another little helper. And what I did with mine is, this was block number 1 and block number 2 in the software combined. The seam line of these 2 blocks is somewhere underneath here. So this is an actual size of those 2 5-inch blocks. Why is this important? Because on the templates here, hooping number 1 is this here, and it includes these leaves, but it doesn't include this tulip. This is hooping number 2 over here on the right-hand side. So how are we gonna line those 2 things up? We're gonna print a template like this. So putting some thought into this process, it's not just common sense. This is years of experience that I'm talking about here. So because I sat there at these templates, I had these printed up, and then I said, well, how am I gonna get these 2 things lined up? And I said, oh, duh, make yourself a bottom where these 2 designs have to intersect, put this down on the table, and then manipulate these 2 templates so that things are going to line up. You see all this in here? I don't have it exactly right on top of each other, but this is what you have to do so that you can then figure out how you're gonna take those 2 together. All right? Yeah. And then, so then the last part of this design is this hooping number 3 up at the top where these little tulips are at. And what we're gonna do with this one is, we're gonna get our template, we're gonna trim all around the bottom of these tulips. Like right here, you can see that I've lifted it up. This is a template that I've already used. And then we're going to be able to take this template and we're going to stick it on top of these stems. See that? And we're going to be able to take that down so that it goes on top of the stems for each one of those tulips. So that's how we're going to put our template together. And just some nice sharp paper scissors, a little bit of time. It actually really helps also if the surface that you're maneuvering your templates around on isn't real slippery. Because I found that sometimes when I'm trimming my templates, I do it in my kitchen. And my countertop is a stone countertop and it's really slippery. And these templates are slipping around on the countertop. So having a table that's not too slick, because you need precision here. So that just is another little aside about how you're going to get these things to stick together and be accurate. So that's how you're going to work with your templates, okay? Camera is that we took the template that we had prepared and taped together, and we had marked all the crosshair marks for hooping number 1. This is the center, this is north, south, east, and west. All right, and one of the things I like to do is on my fabric, I usually like to put a little arrow to show that that was the top of the hoop for each one of these hoopings, just in case we get confused. I like to use either heat erase or a water erase sharp marker for this, because this is going to take us a considerable amount of time to actually get embroidered. And if we use an air erase marker, you're going to have to remark your marks. So, you know, unfortunately, I don't like permanent or the kinds of markers that stay with you a really long time, but in this case, that's what we have to go for. So we've used heat erase markers, very fine point, and we're ready to get this into the hoop. So another preparation step that we recommend doing is that we prepare our hoop, and I'm talking about the inner hoop. We use some of that double-sided tape. You can buy it in different versions, and you could even use Scotch double-sided tape. That will work. You can even make little rolls of blue painter's tape or masking tape to stick on the back side of your inner hoop. Anything that's going to help you to get this stuck to your fabric that has been marked. So let's get this piece of fabric. This is Nancy's, and we're looking at this here, and I can tell this is hooping number 1. This is the top of the hoop. So next step is to find the grid. I don't know where our grid went. A minute later, we find the grid. Another thing, while we're waiting for it, let's just also comment that on this hoop here, she has used some of the hoop grip that we can get. This is also a really neat little extra notion that we can buy, and it's a double-sided, slightly bumpy material that you can put along the inside edges of our hoops, and that also helps to hold our hoops a little bit tighter in the fabric. So sometimes people like to also put this around the corner areas rather than just along the long edges, because this is one of the areas where your fabric might have some issues where, you know, when you hoop it, all kinds of cuckoo things can happen. All right, so we've got a grid. Make sure that you've got your up to the upper part of your hoop. Don't put it in upside down, otherwise you're gonna have some alignment problems. And this is a sticky hoop now. So what I'm gonna do is just find my center point. This is the top of the hoop, and I'm gonna get my hoop with its grid, and I'm just going to stick it down right on top of that crosshair as best as I can. And then I'm just going to use a little bit of pressure along the outside edges of these to hold this sticky stuff onto the hoop. Over here it's not sticking very well. Close enough. All right, grab it all, hold all of these layers together, the fabric with that hoop, and take it over to your cloth setter. Your hoop has been pre-tensioned, which means that we already hooped our stabilized fabric, and we tightened up the screw to the degree that we needed it to be tight. So now we don't have to hopefully mess with that screw anymore. So just get it positioned on top of that inner hoop on top of the outer hoop. Make sure you don't have anything in the way, that you're not double layering any of your fabric, and just push it on down. And I'm hoping that nothing's gonna move, because we're a little bit tight. Anyway, that's how you hoop it. And if you've done a good job with this, we're gonna hope that I haven't moved mine too much. We're pretty spot on. Can you see the center mark underneath there? So we know that we've hooped accurately now. I'm just afraid this is gonna pop out. I think it's in there good enough. Okay, now you're ready to take this over to your machine.
I just want to look at that one more time. It's just
You're a little bit off over here.
And so do I need
That's
to
your
re-
arrow. That's
Okay.
not your dot right there. That's your arrow.
Right.
Yeah.
This is my dot.
The dot is right there.
Yeah.
So I don't know, if we're a tiny smidgen off because of what we're making, that we have no wiggle room at all with this design and this hoop, we probably ought to just go through this process once again and just make sure that we're perfectly centered in the hoop.
So
Okay?
that's what we're gonna do.
So that's what we're gonna do.